For most guilds, the Curator is the first shot at Tier 4 loot. The Curator drops the glove token, and he's also a significant increase in difficulty from most of the encounters that you've faced in Karazhan up to this point. Every 2 minutes, the Curator will evocate, and while he's not evocating, he will be throwing out these astral flares every 10 seconds. The astral flares don't have a lot of hit points, and basically this is the DPS test part of the event for your raid group. Your DPS needs to be able to kill each astral flare before the next flare shows up. If you're having a real hard time doing that, then you're probably not going to have the DPS for this fight, or you're going to rely on your healers really having to work overtime in order to take down this boss. As long as your DPS is able to take down the flares before the next one comes out, so each flare every 10 seconds, you've sort of passed the first part of the DPS chest, and typically will have enough to deal with the entire encounter. But the other challenge to this event is that it's a real durability test. Curator has around 1 million hit points, and even though you do 250% damage during his evocation, it just means that you have to do a lot of damage consistently over time between the astral flares and the Curator himself. Makes it very easy for mana-based range DPS to go ohm and to just run out of juice, and then for your healers to also run out of juice, because while they're also having to heal the damage the astral flares deal, they're having to heal your tank and your soaker throughout the entirety of the fight. So the key to this fight is really to bring as much DPS as possible to burn down the flares and then Curator as fast as you can. Now, here you're going to see us burn down the second to last ad. He summons another ad and then begins to evoke. So the decision is made at this point to simply focus fire the Curator and let that ad sit on top of one of the healers and let the healer just heal himself through the event. This gives us maximum time during evocation to do as much damage as possible, but here's the catch. Now it means we have 2 ads out. We have the ad that we left up from the prior evocation prep, and then the one that he just put out. This means that you're going to put an extra burden on the healers right after the evocation, because you have to burn down 2 ads, and then another one will come out every 10 seconds. So the DPSers at this point have to make sure they have a little bit of extra punch going into this second round of astral flares so they can play catch up and burn down the astral flares and get back on top of the once every 10-second game. If you're able to do that, it really allows you to burn down the Curator more effectively, because what it means is that you're able to maximize the amount of time that you're DPSing Curator by not wasting your time on that last astral flare. The other thing to keep in mind in looking at the way that this raid group is positioned is that the healers and the range DPS are sort of in a big U around the Curator. The reason for this is that the astral flares chain a lightning effect if more than one person is close to them. So the more spread out you are, the easier this event is to handle. It can make bringing melee DPS a very difficult proposition, because if the melee DPS are running after the flares, they're going to be chaining more of the effect from the astral flares and causing a lot more problems for the healers. But sometimes you just don't have an option. So melee heavy groups tend to also need to have stronger healers around in order to make up for the extra damage that's going to be taken by the raid. Now, in this situation, the decision is made to simply allow 2 of the DPSers to focus on the last ad and let the entire rest of the raid focus on Curator. The healers are getting lower on mana, and so they don't want to have to sit there and heal through that astral flare and then have more than one flare out during the next set of astral flares. So by only having 2 of the DPSers focus on the flare, it minimizes the damage going into the next round. So now when the next astral flare comes out, you can catch up because you're right on top of your game. Healers particularly can find this a frustrating fight. It's very mana intensive. There's a lot of raid damage being taken. It's persistent and continual damage. The main tank and the soaker are constantly taking damage, and it just adds up to a lot of damage over what can be a relatively long fight. That's why it's also important for the DPS to stretch a little, and if they can, to really maximize their time so that you only have to deal with 2 evocations. Once the Curator gets below 15%, he'll stop summoning astral flares. He will no longer evocate. He does a minor enrage, which isn't that big of an increase to his damage and to the hateful bolt damage, but it is a little bit of an upgrade. But far preferable to having to deal with the astral flares doing raid damage. If possible, as in this scenario, we just like to keep our melee DPS on Curator the entire time. If your range DPS is high enough that you can burn down those astral flares without needing the melee DPS, then it's far preferable to just let the melee DPS sit on Curator the entire time, maximize their damage, and minimize the amount of raid damage being taken. Healers and mana DPS classes should bring lots of super mana pots, anything else that can allow them to extend the life of their DPS. You're going to find yourself going through a lot of mana in this fight, and just being able to last the full duration of the event is typically the biggest challenge for them. One last comment about the soaker. In this fight, there's one main tank, and then you typically want a soaker. The Curator will throw out a hateful bolt at the person with the highest number of hit points that's next on his aggro list. So it's good to have either an off tank with a lot of hit points that simply stays on Curator and soaks up those hateful bolts, or to have like a Warlock or some other class in stamina gear. You can have almost anybody do it. With or without arcane gear is just fine.